Yeah, it worked. Good. Well, hello. Welcome back to my channel, and especially to my two wonderful guests who I have here, who I'm going to introduce properly in a minute. But I want to kind of set the stage here first. So the first thing I want to say is this is part two of an ongoing discussion series that Joanna and I will be doing. So the first one we did was book difficulty, which is on her channel. I'll link that down below. This is going to be part two. Although you will also see there's a mysterious third person in this chat who we'll get to in a minute. I will introduce both of these guests or allow them to introduce themselves in a second, but I want to begin with a story. And I haven't told either of my guests that I'm going to tell this story. So guys, when I was living in Japan the first time, I had this friend called Emmy. And Emmy was this marvelous human being, is this marvelous human being who worked a million jobs. You know how you have these people who work like 9 different jobs? So Emmy is one of those people. And she used to work in this restaurant in Tokyo. And it was one of these restaurants that kind of was themed. And she invited me to come to her restaurant after she'd finished her employment there. She just wanted to show it to me. So we sit down in this restaurant, me and Emmy, and I order some food. And the food comes, but the server wouldn't give it to me. She wouldn't give me the food. And I'm kind of looking at my friend, and I'm looking at the server, and I'm going, what's going on? And my friend says to me, I kid you not, she's like, this is a musical restaurant. If you want your food, you have to sing. If you want your food, you have to sing. And I kind of went, I don't want to sing. I just want my food. And Amy looks at me and she says with a smile on her face, and this is the crux of this story. She says, the music isn't optional. And for me, that line always stuck with me. Okay, the music isn't optional, because I think this also applies to a lot of different arenas of our lives. And this is the discussion we wanted to have today. That was a very long, ambly way to begin this conversation. We wanted to talk about music in fantasy. I think it's something that we all hold dear, is music. And obviously we all have booktube channels. Fantasy is something we really hold dear. So now that I've given my very long preamble, I'd like to both of the guests to introduce themselves and maybe talk a little bit about what music means to them. And Nikhil, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, mate.
Sure, yeah. No, I'm so thrilled to be here. And funny thing I was thinking about while you're telling that story is like, that's like talk about singing for your supper, literally, you know? um, but yeah, no, for me, I think like music has always been a huge part of my life. You know, I grew up playing piano. I always wanted to explore music as a career. And then I got a chance to start writing music for film and TV. And then around 2019, I discovered the Wheel of Time, and just basically it blew my mind. You know, it showed me what fantasy could be. And it kind of got me back into reading as an adult. I used to be a voracious reader as a kid. And then I kind of stopped around college. You know, as a lot of people I feel like can relate to that story. And I picked it up again in my adulthood. And 2019 was that year where I kind of thought to myself, I love reading. I love music. I wish I could combine both into one thing. And so that ended up culminating in Wheel of Time, reading the Wheel of Time series and writing a pitch for it, a musical pitch that I recorded with the Budapest Orchestra. And that led to me being hired on the show. So, you know, I feel like fantasy is just such a blank canvas when it comes to storytelling. You know, you can have so many subgenres: fantasy horror, you know, fantasy sci-fi, fantasy coming of age. You know, there's so many subgenres in it. And I think music as well has so many subtle nuances when it applies to that storytelling. So just, I feel like there's so much that is intertwined in the two. And I think now, especially, and I know we'll probably get into this stuff a lot more, I feel like music is becoming that much more a part of the tapestry of both storytelling, the way authors approach their work, the way readers meet that work. So yeah, I'm a fan of both, and it's fun to combine them when you can.
That was so beautifully said, Nikhil. And it's just
Oh,
amazing the way that your fantasy journey and your music journey just combined so beautifully and so successfully in your life. Love that.
thanks.
Yeah. As for me, you know, it's interesting because hearing you talk, it brought me back to some memories that I'd forgotten about. So I also grew up highly involved in music since I can remember, in choir throughout middle school and high school. And in fact, when I discovered fantasy, I discovered it through a group of friends that were into fantasy, that were into this is so nerdy and embarrassing, but I've said it before, so I'll go ahead and admit it now. That we're into live action role playing. If you know what that is,
yeah.
yeah.
That's
And
awesome.
Yeah, they were into Dungeons and Dragons and all types of things like that. And so I hung out with the fantasy nerd crowd when I was a teenager. And because I was into singing, I also, when we'd get together as a friend group sometimes around a campfire and just tell stories. And they would have me get up and they'd have me sing this song called One Tin Soldier. I don't know if any of you have heard of it before, but my best friend taught it to me at the time. And it is actually a fantasy story about two warring kingdoms. And so I'd get up and I'd sing the song. And I kid you not, every time we got together, they'd make me sing it like 3 times in a row. And they were like, oh, we love you singing that song. So I actually, yeah, it's interesting because it brought me back to that memory. I'm like, there was a connection between fantasy story and singing and music for me. But yes, like my background is heavily in music. My degrees are in music. So I'm excited to talk about this. I don't feel like when it comes to fantasy and music, I'm as nitpicky as some people are about the way music is represented in the story. But I do love seeing it represented. And I feel like a lot of people I hear these days say that they love to skip the songs. And I'm here to say, I feel like music representation adds so much. It can add so much depth to a story. And I think we have some great examples that we're going to discuss today.
I feel like I can just sit back like this and just sort of enjoy my hour. First of all, the fantasy nerdy group is the coolest group. Let's just get that out there.
100%.
For real.
Highly agree.
Yeah. Second of all, I played the flute in high school, so that's the pedigree that I'm bringing to this conversation. Johanna, you just said that brilliantly. I have in our Google Doc written our thesis statement, as it were, but I think Johanna, you just encapsulated this superbly. I've written here, music is not padding in stories, and as Johanna, you just said, music is not padding. It's not this thing you can sort of get past, and it just kind of adds to the page count. In fantasy, we don't need more pages. It's not padding. It's a deep, complex part of storytelling and world building. For me, if music is integrated into a fantasy story, it is as important as something like magic or a magic system. It does something. It affects us. And I think what I kind of want to do in the first half of this conversation is sort of unpick all the different functions music can have in fantasy. Because I think if we just kind of use this broad brush to say music is there, we're not getting as nuanced as we could possibly be. So we might bring up a couple of spoilers in this discussion. It sounds as though we have similar stories that we've read, so we'll be okay with each other. But I will timestamp anything if I think there's a particularly strong spoiler that might diminish some people's enjoyment of a particular narrative. But guys, I'm not even going to choose either of you. I'm just going to throw this open to both of you. How is music used in story? What are some of the ways that music can be used in a fantasy story? Do you have any ideas there, either of you?
So many. Nikhil, do you want to start?
Gosh, yeah, it's almost hard to pick one to start with because there are so many. I guess, I think about the way we evolved I was reading this book called Sapiens a couple years ago, and it really changed my perspective on the way we've evolved. And it talks about Homo sapiens and how, we weren't the strongest or the fastest or had the biggest brain capacity, but one thing that we had the ability to do is tell stories and get large groups of people to cooperate based on those stories. And so that was kind of the thing that helped us survive and thrive, And so I think storytelling has always been in our DNA. And I think there's different languages to storytelling, and music is a language that helps with storytelling. So I think about music in the function of like when you see songs in a book, and oftentimes it's a way the characters are telling each other's stories within the larger story. So I remember when I first read The Hobbit when I was younger, and like I kind of got little bits and pieces of those songs' functionality, but I don't think I realized how deep those could go at that age, and then now revisiting that stuff as an adult and also working on music for a living, I think like I'm much more attuned to that and seeing how it seems to function as a storytelling thing. And then I guess the second thing I would say is as a world building device, I mean, you think about it in terms of whether characters play instruments or they are musically inclined, or the author is musically inclined and they're able to imbue that into the work, and then, you think about how those stories are adapted. And that is another musical world building component where it's like, how can we make the music, whether it be the the vocalization on the page, the way the lyrics are written, or the way that is expressed as a piece of music outside of the medium,
Yes.
it's thinking about like how can we make it not sound like, oh, this is an Asian instrument or an Indian instrument. It's like, no, this belongs to this world and this world only. So that's just a couple things that come to mind from my end. But yeah, Joanna, what do you think?
I love that. I love that too, especially that last point, because if you're composing music for a fantasy world, and which you have experience with, you have to think outside our world to some extent, but obviously use music from our world. So I mean, that's what fantasy authors are doing too, right? But it's interesting because you are trying to create this more ethereal aspect to the music.
Yeah.
And that's so neat. I hadn't thought about that as much in depth before. So I love all the points that you brought up. And I guess what comes up for me is just thinking about music as culture. I feel like music says a lot about the culture. It could say a lot about the culture of the fantasy story. I know we'll get into examples. There are also examples of music as magic in fantasy. It could also be a means towards solidarity or people coming together for a common cause. It can also be a means of showing some kind of history or lore in the world. I guess that also speaks to the cultural aspect. So there are multiple ways that I think song presents itself. It could present itself as ceremony. There's an example that comes to my mind for that. So yeah, I'm absolutely excited. I think that also song, just like story, we talk about the oral tradition of story, but song can also be an oral tradition of passing along story. So it can be a way of using it towards political messaging or telling events of history, whether it's accurate or inaccurate. And we see that as well. So I think it can show up in a variety of ways and in important ways that affect that not only our cultural touches in a story, but also can directly affect the plot or affect the characters in ways that you might not realize. So I think there are so many different ways it could show up.
So the challenge now is choosing one of these about 9 different avenues that we've opened up to pursue. I'm quite interested, and this kind of combines a couple of them together. It's also the first thing that you said, Nikhil, music as determiner of identity. You said something like the stories that we tell ourselves to make sense of ourselves. Maybe we could start with that one, because you spoke about The Hobbit, Nikhil, and I think there's a really good example there with the Misty Mountain song. So at the very beginning of The Hobbit, and it's in the book and the movie, I believe, right? Where the dwarves are singing this song of their homeland. And it's their mission statement of what they want to do, which is go and reclaim the mountain that has been taken from them by Smaug, if I'm not mistaken. But it's also them telling themselves who they are. And I think Tolkien was really, really clever with that, with kind of opening The Hobbit with that, because it tells you so much about who these dwarves are, but also who they are to themselves. It's them describing themselves and using that as a means of self-identity and self-determination. I'm wondering if either of you can think of any other examples where music is used in this similar kind of way of identity, whether that's cultural identity or maybe one person's identity or a group's identity. Joanna, if I go back to you, is there anything that comes to mind there?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many examples. There are a couple of examples that come to mind, and I think that these two examples I'm going to bring up, I think, will come up multiple times for me in this discussion, I'm assuming. So one of them is Wars of Light and Shadow by Jenny Wirtz. The main character there, as Nikhil knows, he's read a few of the books, is a musician, and I think it is such a huge part of his personal identity in the story, and it's a part of his identity that he grapples with for various reasons, as you'll find out when you start the series. And so you can see it expressed there. You can also see it, I think, in Mercedes Lackey's Arrows trilogy. The main character, I think her name is Talia, if I'm not mistaken. She has a beautiful mentor relationship in the first book, and she's a singer. And so that also turns into a form of her identity. And then, but as far as cultural identity, the first example that comes to mind for me is A Song for Our Bond by Guy Gavriel Kay, which Nikhil and David, you've read it, right?
Yes, it's a fabulous book.
I haven't read it yet. I still have to.
You've got to read it, Nikhil. You've got to read it. I mean, I will gift it to you. I will gift it to you. I think it's one of the strongest depictions of song influencing a narrative that I've ever read.
Wow.
And in the story, we have a culture in the South that's seen as, I mean, there is a sort of matriarch. I don't know that I would necessarily call that culture a matriarchy. It, but but it does seem to uphold women into a higher degree than the other culture in the North, which is very patriarchal and misogynist. And the people in the South who do respect women, they are also a culture of troubadours. It's inspired by Middle Ages France. So it is a culture of troubadours, and you do get song that's important for that culture. But there does seem to be this idea that song and men who sing or people who compose, that's more of an effeminate thing to the people in the North, and it plays an important role in the story too. But yeah, I think that the cultural aspect of that is significant in A Song for a Bond, among other things.
That's brilliant. I
Yeah.
really have to read that book. I've only read the Lions of Al-Rasan so far, which I loved, and so I need to
Amazing.
go on my GGK journey at some point. But yeah,
Beautiful. Yeah,
so cool.
absolutely.
Another interesting thing about Song for a Bon is kind of the idea of who music kind of creating power in a sense.
Yes.
The troubadours who can decide what story is told and the song that accompanies that story. So in some ways, they're kind of in creative control of the landscape. Like you do have these powerful kind of leaders of this nation, but at the same time, their control is slightly what's the word? Set at one remove, because they're not the ones controlling the narrative. It's these people walking around the landscape, telling stories of the people they want to tell stories about. That also has a degree of control in this land. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Johanna.
I do. And I love, without giving too much away for the story, I love how the people in the North, the misogynist culture, they are threatened by it. They're threatened by art and music because of that, because of the stories that it could tell and the truths it can reveal through narrative in story. So yeah, it's an amazing example, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think you're right as well about that idea of kind of music often being associated with the feminine and femininity, and how that actually leads to, I mean, I don't want to spoil the story in any way, but maybe a degree of it's a misstep to say that music is only for the feminine, and it can cause blind spots and things like that. Nikhil, I don't know if you want to add to that, or if there are any texts that are coming up as we're having this conversation.
Yeah, I was trying to think because there's so many, I think, that, and they all are very different. So I guess a couple examples that come to my mind is Wheel of Time is a great example, because even though music is not at the forefront, like say Wars of Light and Shadow, one thing that Robert Jordan I think did really well was he was very good at the confluence of cultures, actually, and whether it be on the page just as characterizations, different geographical locations that the characters visit, where it's like you don't really know where one culture ends and the other begins. And I think the songs they sing in these different locations are a reflection of that. So, kind of taking that out of the medium and then bringing that into like a TV adaptation, that was like one thing that we were very cognizant of. It's like, how can we combine instruments to reflect what Robert Jordan did so well, so that you can't really tell where one culture ends and the other begins. So that's like one concrete example I can think of. The second thing I was thinking of is this is not necessarily overtly music related, but it kind of references music indirectly, which is what's it? Nicholas Eames' uh, Kings of the Wild, I
Wild,
think.
yeah.
Yeah, there you go. I read that like probably a few years ago now, but the whole idea of like they call this fantasy group. There was like this group of people, and it was like getting the band back together, getting the group back together, and there were character callbacks to actual people in music history. So one of the wizards' name was like Moog, which was a reference to Bob Moog, who invented the Moog synthesizer. Stuff like that. So it's not necessarily where music is a world building device or a magic related thing, but it was more of a callback to certain things that are tied in music history. And then I guess maybe the third example I can think of is kind of a deconstruction of that, which is, what if music could be a reflection of the world, but not of that particular world, without spoiling anything? And I think about the first book of the Dark Tower series, The Gunslinger, where there is reference to Hey Jude by the Beatles. You know, it's just like this is the world that moved on is kind of the way it's presented on the first page really of the book. And so, you know, the main character enters like a saloon, and there's, you know, references to pop culture right off the bat, you know, and it's that idea that like, what world is this? Is this a fantasy world? Is this a reflection of our world? Is it a you know, confluence of the two? So I feel like that's almost like a deconstruction of the music as a world building trope, you know.
Do you know what? I'm resentful of you, Nikhil, because
Huh.
the Dark Tower was the one I was going to bring up,
Oh
and
no, sorry.
you are now
I
forbidden
got
from my
carried
channel.
away.
So
I got
dare
carried
you.
away.
I totally agree with you. So I'm not going to spoil anything for the Dark Tower, but this was one that kept coming up in my mind as well, is that the Dark Tower seems to have a lot of, and in fact, Johanna and I were kind of chatting about this the other night, kind of thinking about all the examples that the Dark Tower has, where it references modern or kind of in the last 50 years songs. So I've got some written down here. I've got, what did I see? I saw Streets of Laredo is that kind of modern, that old kind of folk country song is in one of the books. Hey Jude, absolutely. At the very beginning of book one, I think Hey Jude pretty much comes up.
Yeah.
Velcro Fly by ZZ Top comes
ZZ
up.
Top, yep.
Man of Constant Sorrow by Bob Dylan is in that series at some point. This whole series is sort of laced with kind of musical pop culture. And for me, what that does, and I'd be curious if I think all of us here have read The Dark Tower. For me, this kind of creates a sense of disjunct or discord, I guess might be a way of putting it, that because we're in this fantasy world and we're hearing these modern kind of pop songs coming in, or you know, our world songs, that kind of makes me kind of confused. It sort of shunts me out of the narrative in some way. I don't quite know how to articulate it, but by including these songs, I find myself even more uncertain of the world King has created, because I don't know where his world ends and ours begins. I think the Dark Tower is a really good example to zoom in on. I don't know if either of you have any kind of follow-up thoughts on that.
I feel like as you go on in this series, the more and more you see the world bleed together and pop cultural influences coming through. And that hit me pretty hard in Wolves of the Kala with that Elton John song. I can't remember the name of the title. You have it in front of you, probably, David.
I did, and I've just closed it.
Oh, sorry.
Was it Someone Saved My Life Tonight?
Yes, that one. Yeah. How it kept coming up over and over again. And so I feel like it also, I don't know if this is accurate to say, because I don't know if it necessarily goes along with that timeline, but it not only brings together our world. What I love about the Dark Tower is that we're not only exploring a fantasy world and our real world, but we're also exploring our real world in different timelines too.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that song that comes through, it makes everything kind of bleed through. It's interesting how it does that. I understand what you mean, David. I think it had the same effect on me.
And I think there's other, I don't want to spoil series that I know you guys haven't read, but I find that this happens whenever modern music or our world music is used in fantasy worlds, and maybe that's through portal fantasy or other means, it does kind of have this disruptive effect. I'm going to give one example, which is Dungeon Crawler Carl, my beloved. Without spoiling anything about Dungeon Crawler Carl, well, spoiling one minor thing because you have to. One of the spells that Carl gets in this series is some kind of tripwire device, like a kind of an alarm goes off, but it's never an alarm. It's always something from the top 10 in the last 50 years. So maybe a goblin will step on this tripwire, and suddenly, I don't know, I'm Still Standing by Elton John will start blaring it like absolutely like max volume. And I really enjoy this because for me, whenever you hear these kinds of kind of, what could you call it, cultural markers in a fantasy story, it almost makes you step back and realize how weird the story that you're reading is. It sort of makes you kind of step back and reevaluate the world that you're in, because sometimes when you're immersed in a fantasy world, it begins to feel second nature. But I love when fantasy stories use kind of real world material. It always kind of makes me, I guess it defamiliarizes what has just been familiarized over the course of the reading experience. So it's something that I find really interesting. I want to touch on maybe one more. I know we've kind of been scattering around a bunch of different texts, but I think there's one that we absolutely have to bring up in terms of its music and its musical culture, which is A Song of Ice and Fire. I think it's a really good one to bring up. Johanna, I know that you have some stuff written down on this, so maybe I'll invite you to begin the discussion here, if that's okay. Why did you write down Song of Ice and Fire in terms of its representation of music?
Well, there are several songs in A Song of Ice and Fire, so forgive me that I'm not listing all of them. I'm sure we could look up a Wikipedia on A Song of Ice and Fire and just come up with a huge list. But I know that when the songs come up, not only are they fun, like for example, the one that I just got a kick out of was a bear, a maiden bear, something like that. I love that title. I love how that came up in the story. It added this quirky bit of humor in a scene that felt uncomfortable at the same time, without giving away more. And the Reigns of Castamere is one that is also used in the show, and it's haunting the way that presents itself. And what the song, I believe, it has to do with the history of the Lannisters winning a victory, if I recall correctly. If I get this wrong, I apologize. And yet, where it comes up in the series, it adds an atmospheric effect, and it also adds a layer, I think, of juxtaposition, and it's really well done. Some interesting contrasts. Maybe I'll put it that way. And the other thing that I noticed about A Song of Ice and Fire that I loved is that I read the 5-book series a couple of times, but then last year I read A Night of the Seven Kingdoms, which are those novellas, Dunk and Egg novellas that take place, I think, 100 years before book one, if I recall correctly. And so there's references to some of the same songs. And it felt neat that there was this through line of a historical aspect or cultural aspect from 100 years earlier, that it's still a thing. It just added depth and a layer to the story, just seeing that the songs exist in history as they do in the present day in that world. So I just love the way song is used. And of course, it's called A Song of Ice and Fire, but I'm sure there's much more to be said about that series alone, but those are just a couple of the things that come to my mind.
Just the Reigns of Castamere. I think now I could be saying this, and then I'll check it, and maybe I'll snip it out later. But my understanding is that the Reigns of Castamere is about Tywin Lannister, and it's kind of the lore before the Song of Ice and Fire begins. And I think what happens in this song, and this historical event that the song is portraying, is that Tywin Lannister is conducting a siege against an enemy, and the enemy just sort of kind of holds himself down, puts down the barricades, and is stuck in his castle. And what Tywin Lannister does, and I could be mistaken, is he floods the castle. He basically I forget how he does it, but he basically breaks down a wall and lets the waters just sweep everybody away. So one thing I also love about the Reigns of Castamere, and I'm so glad you brought it up, Johanna, is it's just superb characterization of Tywin Lannister. Because even if you never met this man in the series, or maybe even if he seems very gentle and chill on the page, which he doesn't, but if he did, you would still have this song in the back of your mind that demonstrates to you just how cutthroat and ruthless this man really is. So I think music as characterization is a really interesting point here as well.
Oh, thank you so much for researching what that song was about.
I'm going to check it.
Yeah, thank you.
Nikhil, I don't know if anything is coming to mind as we talk about Song of Ice and Fire for you.
Gosh, I've read it once, and it's been a while actually since I've read those books. So I mean, I think of Reigns of Castamere definitely because of, there's one thing I find interesting about it is it's a historical song, and you think about songs in history that have gotten diluted or changed, the meaning kind of takes on a new meaning over time. And so the way Reigns of Castamere is used later on in a pivotal moment, I won't spoil, but I'm sure a lot of people probably already know, even if they haven't read the books. But yeah, it takes on a new meaning when you think of the history, and then you now see it juxtapositioned against an event that's happening now. And I think like juxtaposition in songs can also change its meaning. So I find that in itself interesting. Like we think about songs in our own history, and think about Ring Around the Rosie is a perfect example of a song that was written in the Black Death period, and then now has become a children's nursery rhyme, and it's like juxtaposition to our time now, and over time things get distorted. So
yes, that's a good point. Yes.
Yeah. So cool.
A tissue, we all fall down, right? Which is everyone dying from Black Death.
Right. Yeah.
And that's actually one of my favorite, like just as a side tangent, that's actually one of my favorite things in music is if you can play with juxtaposition, if you could play with something that's supposed to maybe like the lyrics say one thing and maybe the music itself says something different.
Oh,
And there's,
totally.
yeah, but it kind of goes together in this eerie way. It just creates a new meaning in itself, the combination. It's really neat.
It's so cool. Yeah.
Hmm.
I'm gonna move us on, guys, because we've talked about a bunch of different texts and how they are kind of create these different representations depending upon how they're handled. But I think one other thing to touch upon is the kind of link between heroes and heroism and protagonists and music. And Johanna, you touched on this with Wars of Light and Shadow, but I think it's worth kind of leaning into a bit more that so often in these texts, music is connected with protagonists. Wars of Light and Shadow, Name of the Wind. I would even argue to an extent Wheel of Time with the Horn of Valere and things like that
Oh,
is a
yeah.
musical element. Why is it that we connect protagonists with music in a way that we don't seem to connect with antagonists? This sounds like I'm asking someone to defend their dissertation, but I'm gonna throw this question at
Love this
Nikhil
question.
to see if you have any thoughts on that. Why do we connect protagonists with music and not antagonists usually?
It's a good
Or do you
question.
agree with that?
I would say I do agree with that, and I think maybe one of the reasons is I just thinking about it. The classic hero's journey, which a lot of these fantasy novels follow, to some degree, right? Um, in that journey, there's always a search for identity, and I think music is an expression of the self in a lot of ways. Like a lot of the reasons people choose to dive into music is they want to express themselves, and they want to share that with other people. So there's a community aspect of it. There's also an inner search that's involved in it, and I think like music is in some ways a reflection of the character's journey. It's like there's the outer search, the kind of the plot based search that the character's on. There's the inner search for self identity, and maybe music is a part of that. And I think of music as a language just like any other, and it's a way one can express oneself. So if words don't necessarily do justice, music can. And so that's just off the top of my head, that's kind of what comes to mind, is that it's maybe a reflection of the character's inner journey. And to that point, I guess typically, and I love it when fantasy doesn't do this actually, but you don't often get to see that in-depth exploration of the antagonist, if there is a distinct protagonist antagonist.
Yes.
There's plenty of series where that's not the case, which like Malazan Book of the Fallen, and but I do feel where there is a distinct differentiation, maybe that for the protagonists, that inner search is a big part of what they do.
Wow.
That was brilliantly said, wasn't it?
Yeah. This is so interesting. Gosh, I love this question because I can't think of a series. I'm sure there's something out there that I'm not thinking of or that I haven't read that in which the antagonist is the musician.
Yeah.
And I wonder if some of that has to do with the fact that this is just a guess, me just shooting darts in the dark, but I wonder if it has to do with the fact that fantasy literature is art. And maybe the people who are writing this art, they are people who are pro humanities. And so, of course, music and humanities are going to save the day, as we all say these days, because it's not something that our society seems to be valuing as much. And
Yeah.
maybe that plays a
Interesting.
role. I don't know. I'm just guessing. That's maybe one part of it. But I love what you said, Nikhil, about the identity aspects. I think that's absolutely key to it too. I mean, that's part of it is understanding who we are, the roots of who we are. So our identity as individuals and also our collective identities too, understanding the roots of that as well.
That's brilliant. I would have never thought of it quite that way, actually, Joanna. That's amazing. It got me also thinking about maybe the authors themselves. The people who write these novels, these series. Maybe they're also thinking in terms of they write themselves into these books, I'm sure, to some extent, and so maybe they're exploring some of that through the characters. Getting a little meta here, but
No, I wonder that too, because I know I've heard there's a lot of conversation about how Lord of the Rings, for example, is anti-industrialism and also callback to nature. And if you think about it, yeah, the heroes, the good guys, they're. I mean, are there songs? Are there songs on the other side?
Well, there's war
They are
drums and
works.
things like that. But basically, the only thing I can think of is war drums to keep the beat as they march. I guess
Mm,
for a lot of these kind of more
there you
traditional
go.
fantasy stories, if we can stick with that, music is creation, and creation is usually associated with protagonists and heroes. I mean, I was also thinking about Narnia, the first book in Narnia. How does Aslan create Narnia? He sings it into existence. You know, it's not just the word; he's singing it. Music is
Yeah.
creative, and I guess in these more traditional fantasy stories, the antagonist is usually a force of destruction, trying to tear something down. And so I think that's why we don't get as much music traditionally on the other side. And what do we get when antagonists produce sound? It's usually howls, screeches, growls. It's animalistic, it's bestial. And it's almost as if some of these authors, I don't know if either of you would agree or disagree with this, it's almost as though the authors portray the enemy as incapable of the creative process that creates, that music is a part of. But you're right, Joanna. I'm trying to think of a single
Brilliant.
text that has music in its antagonist. I guess there must be some, because often music is used as a means of seduction, of temptation.
Yeah.
But I can't
But,
think of one off the top of my head.
but you're right. I mean,
Yeah.
another example that comes to mind, not necessarily, I don't know that I would say good or bad. But Baker's war scenes, there are people coming together with this common cause that have a battle song, which could be seen in a critical light, maybe. I'm not sure. I mean, there are various ways to look at that, I suppose.
Nikhil, did I cut you off
Yeah.
there as well?
No, same. I was basically just exclaiming the same thing. I was like, that's never thought of it that way before.
Yeah.
I it did get me thinking about Lord of the Rings actually, and if correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that was influenced by kind of World War II and right, like that the orcs and everything were like a reflection of the Nazis, or is that something that was?
A lot of
I think
people
one of
say
the
that.
was.
And at the same time, Tolkien says that it's not
It's not
allegorical.
okay. Okay,
So
got
I
it.
don't
Yeah,
know. But I mean, a lot of people do speculate that his
sure.
involvement in the war influenced the story. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I wondered about that. I wasn't sure what the actual, hearing it from the source. But I do feel like if you think about dictatorships or people who are trying to dominate the world, let's put it that way, something that is more broad. Their main goal is control, and control is the absence of freedom of expression, and music is one of the most individual ways to actually express oneself. So I would imagine also in that way that the antagonist is trying to quell self-expression, and that
Mm.
includes culture, includes art, music, all sorts of
Yeah.
stuff.
I think from and I know this has already been covered slightly, but I'm looking down my notes. I think, yeah, when it's used by antagonists, it's usually to whip into a frenzy, isn't it? It's for violence, or it's for kind of religious, maybe hysteria. Those are kind of the main reasons. But yeah, and then we also have this issue of kind of musical instruments being the one, what do you call them? Sometimes the MacGuffin or the token symbol in so many of these stories. I mean, I know that the horn in Wheel of Time is one of the symbols that is so kind of central to that series. I don't know if you guys can think of any other musical instruments or kind of musical items as central to a fantasy story. I don't know if anything's coming up there for either of you.
I don't know if I can think of. I mean, it feels like string instruments are pretty common in fantasy, but maybe that's also because string instruments were common historically. Yeah, I don't know that I have as much to say about the symbolism of an instrument. Do you feel?
I'm not quite sure either. I was thinking about like Name of the Wind. I was thinking about Erathon's character in Horse of
Yes.
Light and Shadow.
Mhm.
I wonder if the instrument was a symbolic as much as it was a conduit for something.
Yes.
It feels more like it was a conduit for something rather than that particular instrument symbolizing something itself.
Yeah.
Like maybe a weapon would or something. Like in some fantasy series. I
Yeah.
don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah. But while we're on this topic, do you mind, David, if I pivot to music as magic?
Of course you can.
Since we brought up Erathon, because that's one of the most clever things that I think I've seen in when it comes to music and fantasy is Wars of Light and Shadow, because the music, it's a form of magic in the storytelling, but it's also part of the, like, everything is so integral when it comes to the magic and the music, because everything in Wars of Light and Shadow in that world is based on the idea that everything is vibration. So if you look at music, music is frequency, which is a form of vibration, and light is a form of vibration, right?
Yeah.
And so the idea there is Wars of Light and Shadow is the idea that even emotion and expression is a form of frequency. Like that, the more elevated your frequency, the more colorful, the more light bound, the darker or lower your frequency, the more shadow is, I guess. I mean, there's some plays and contrast with that idea. It's not necessarily that straightforward, but there are also what are called musical lanes. And so, yeah, everything is based on this metaphysics idea of vibration. So the music is part of that. The even the mythical creatures of the world, which are unicorns, sun children, centaurs, they are part of that vibrational cycle. So I think it's really integral to the story. So it's not just music is magical and it's like a separate thing. It's like it's integral to every aspect of the world, and even the earth itself, the world itself, like the vibration of the world itself. I feel like it's all physical, all metaphysically based magic, which is kind of cool because I'm somebody who doesn't really care for scientific magic in the sense of like a author explaining in detail how the magic works, but I don't feel like you get detailed explanations of how this stuff works. You're just kind of given a little bit here and there to put together this picture of like, oh, these are all interconnected. Nikhil, would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm less I've only read, I think, up to War Host of Vastmark so far, but even then, I get a little bit of a taste of, the musical philosophy, maybe for lack of a better word, that Jenny Words puts into the words, and I think also, the reason she's able to do that in the way that she is, which I think is like you said, Joanna, it's like one of the best examples, really, of music as a function of magic, but not necessarily being over explained or making it too much of a one-to-one correlation or something. Is that Jenny Wirtz is plays the bagpipes, and she's like entered competitions and also yeah, so
That's so cool.
it's so cool, right? And so she understands the language of music, and I'm always fascinated when authors do that, because they can put some, I feel like, even a higher degree of authenticity into it, because they know what it feels like to create this stuff, or they know what it feels like to strive to hone one's craft, right? And so some of the magic aspects are a reflection of that. It feels very authentic when I think about Erathon's character, for instance.
Yeah, and it's neat because she doesn't. I mean, she does use some musical terminology here and there, but it's very. I think she's very careful with it because it doesn't, for the most part, because the way she describes it at the same time feels like it's in its own world. It's like when she talks about. I'm trying to think of like. I don't know. The way she describes it, it does sound like it almost has its own tonal system in some ways. I don't know. It's very unique in the way she does that. And yeah, that's a good example of an author who's very well researched in music to depict that in fantasy.
I've got two follow-up questions, if you don't mind, as someone who hasn't read a page of Wars of Light and Shadow, and you guys can choose one or whatever. I guess the first one is, I remember, I think it was Jimmy Nuts talking about the magic in Baker, and he said that the magic in Baker is always destructive. So if we have this thing in Wars of Light and Shadow, where music is sort of twinned with magic, and those two things kind of vibrationally are kind of braided, how is magic represented in Wars of Light and Shadow? Is it represented as a positive, kind of wondrous force, or is it kind of represented as like a dark antagonistic force, or somewhere in the middle?
Both. I think both. Yeah. I would say both. And I think that's safe to say. Would you say both, Nikhil, from where you are?
From what I've gathered so far, it seems like it's leaning towards both. But I figured you would know better than I.
No, I think it's safe to say both.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say both. I don't think it's a spoiler to say for book one, you're dealing with this mist wraith curse that is a dark force. And you have the war of light, the war of shadow. I think I could say very spoiler free and safely. I would say both for sure. But it's just it's just exploring, like I said, the different resonance or vibrations of how that expression. I think magic is sort of a expression of that vibrational thing. Everything's interconnected, though. That's the thing that I think you'll love about Wars of Light and Shadow. If you do pick it up, David, thinking about your magic video, about thinking about magic and what it's representing, is that it's interwoven into the environmental aspect of the world, into the emotional aspect of the world, into even society, the way people treat each other, the way I feel like it's if you look at the whole entire interplay of good and evil, it's explored through that.
That's
everything's interconnected with the music, the magic, the color, the vibration, all of it. Magical creatures. Yeah.
Do you know, I feel like I'm the only person on BookTube who hasn't read a single page of Wars of Light and Shadow.
It's never too late, man. It's never too late.
Yeah. My second question, very quickly, and I do want to go on to very quickly talk about adaptation and things like that. Can you guys generally, both of you having some musical background, get a sense of when an author knows what they're talking about when they're writing music? Or do you find that you have that suspension of disbelief and you can't really tell? Do you kind of get intimations and inklings when you're reading something? Nikhil, I'll ask you first.
I do personally. I think I have a hard time turning the music brain off sometimes, and so I felt like Jenny Wirtz is the perfect example of knowing and giving reverence to the craft of music, and whether it be the author putting that into the work, but then also even the characters, the way they treat music. There's like a degree of reverence and authenticity. I think there's certain novels where it's more of a, like, let's kind of, I hate to say shoehorn in, but there is a little bit of that where it's like, hey, that sounds cool. It becomes almost like a gimmick. And, whether there is, whether that author has like music training or not, you can kind of tell when it's put in for the sake of the characters, the story. And oftentimes I find that when that's done, authentically, it's because it comes from an authentic place. That's my thought on it. I don't know. What do you think, Johanna?
Would you be comfortable sharing with us where some book examples of where it maybe fell short for you?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I guess so.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hot takes here. Heard it here first. I think for me personally, and I am completely the outlier on this one because everybody loves Kings of the Wild, and I think they all love the musical references in it. For me personally, I felt very much like it was. I don't like to be like negative about this kind of stuff, but I just felt like naming a character after a musical, like musical legend or something like that. It doesn't feel like it's going deep enough. It feels a bit more surface level. Like the idea of getting a fantasy group back together and trying to link it to the band, it feels like a little bit of a stretch. And it feels a bit more like, like fan service, like, you think about like Ready Player One or something like that, where it's like, which is great and all, but like there's a specific functionality to that where it's like, hey, like almost like, hey, remember that one thing, like it's kind of calling back to stuff, but it's more surface level, I would say. So that kind of stuff for me is not really my cup of tea. But that's my example. I don't know. What do you all think?
Well, I've not read that book, so yeah, I'm glad to hear that. No, that's the thing is I have heard people say that they take issue with this sometimes. Like other musicians on BookTube say that they really struggle with how it can be represented at times. I don't know that I can come up with any examples, or I can't I don't have any memories of times where that stood out to me. I'm not saying it doesn't, but that it's not poorly represented at times. But I can't think of times. I just can't think of examples for me.
Do you know what it makes me think of, Johanna? It makes me think of the difference of representation when poetry is represented in fantasy versus when music is represented in fantasy. Because I often wonder, I mean, Stephen Erickson would be a good example, and I need an excuse to hold up my copy of Gardens of the Moon.
Nice.
One of my copies. Because often Stephen Erickson has these epigraphs, right? And I love these epigraphs, but sometimes they're set as poetry, and sometimes they're said as song lyrics. And this is something that I often think about in my own life as well. What's the difference when you put song lyrics on a page versus poetry on a page? Are they serving the same function? Can you just read song lyrics and have that same kind of deep resonance with a song as when it's that musical stuff is abstracted? So I often wonder why an author chooses to represent something as song versus something as poetry, or if it's just literally a coin toss. I don't know.
I think there certainly can be differences. But at the same time, if you're looking at the two, and if the author doesn't tell you, could you tell the difference between whether it's a poem or whether it's a song? That would be harder to tell, because I mean, there's some songs that set poetry to music. So
True.
Yes.
yeah, that's really tricky.
So I want to move us on, because we obviously have Nikhil here who has worked in adaptation. And so you mentioned Wheel of Time, and we also have the Adan trilogy by Philip Chase is another thing that you worked on to kind of adapt and bring a musical theme to. For you, when you are taking a fantasy work, so we've talked about music and fantasy, and now we're talking about taking the fantasy and creating music around it.
Yeah.
How do you even, this is going to be such a vague question, mate, because I don't even know how do you go about constructing a musical accompaniment to something that is text? How do you bring that to bear? Because I have no idea.
You know, I probably could say the same. I like, if I was trying to quantify it, I would probably say I have no idea as well. But I will say this is like, both things are emotional in a lot of ways. When I read fantasy, I feel emotional in a way that I feel when I play or write a piece of music, and I can connect the emotions together. And I think that's, for me, the starting point. And then everything else follows from there, like the instrumentation. So for me, reading everything related to that particular series is essential. Like before I worked on Wheel of Time, I read all the 15 books, and it was intentional to just be fully immersed in the world, and then naturally you start to kind of speak the same language as the author, because you're so in it, It was the same with the Adan trilogy. Like I read the 3 books and then I started to write. And I was reading them back to back, so I was fully invested in that world at that time. So that becomes the first thing, and for me that's like roots to branches, and then the second thing is figuring out, okay, what is the core theme, not musically, but just the core theme of the story. What do we want to express? So like, for example, when I'd done the original Wheel of Time pitch, it was after I'd read the second book. And there's a huge sequence in that end of the second book, The Great Hunt, which made me feel a way that made me go like, I want to capture the feeling I felt reading that musically. And it was the sense of, adventure and scope and a wider world opening up, kind of taken out of a place you knew and brought out to the great unknown. And so that idea was kind of the core of it. With the Adan trilogy, like the transcendental aspects of it, I thought was just so cool. I just don't see that in fantasy very much, and the way Philip explored that. So I really wanted to kind of go into that. Then the next part of it is, okay, how do I make a melody? Like I always grew up listening to like old school film scoring, and so, like a lot of my favorite songs are probably from the 60s and 70s, where this melody was always up front. And so that's just always been a part of what I love, and Lord of the Rings, I watched those midnight releases in the theaters, and that's what kind of got me into film scoring. So like, for me, I'll sit on the piano, away from picture or away from the book, right? And write out a melodic idea first, and just like play it 50 times, 100 times, till the notes start to coalesce in place, and then you can structure the stuff around it. It's like, okay, what instruments will best express it, and it's like, we're looking at the world building, interesting. So like Adan trilogy, it would be cool to have like a cello, because you could make it sound mournful, you could make it sound triumphant. It's got a lot of things that you could do with it, Oh, kind of almost like percussion that feels like a war band marching. Oh, that's cool. So then you start to figure out the instruments and stuff, but really you're kind of going almost in concentric circles. So your main thing is, what's the thematic representation of the characters, the book itself, or the show, or whatever it is. And then the next thing is like the musical theme, and then the next thing is the support structure, And also part of it becomes like, what's the main thing and what's the other thing? It's like if the melody is the main thing, then you don't want the other stuff, the supporting stuff, to overshadow it. So like a perfect example. Sorry, I'm kind of jumping all over the
No, I
place,
love
I'm
this.
loving
Keep
it.
going.
Yeah.
but a perfect example actually was The Hills of Tenchiko, which was a song I wrote for the season 3, episode 6, and that was a musical number. It was like the cast was singing it, but they wanted sea shanty aspects of the song. They wanted Asian instrumentation, African instrumentation, and it's like, how do you combine all those things? So I did the concentric circles approach. Melody is first. First of all, it's a big moment for Elaine. So it should feel more tenuous at the beginning, then it becomes, more triumphant. There's also a melancholy aspect to that song, because even though it feels like a body bar song, it references the shackled man, which is like a 3,000-year-old historical thing that got distorted over time and now has become, like a body bar song. So what if we could kind of get some of the melancholy of that into the beginning of the song? I tell you a tale of a lad of 20, and it's like all in minor key, and then it goes into major later, stuff like that. And then it was making the melody, and then figuring out, okay, what's the main thing? The melody. So let's keep that sea shanty, and then the support structure is the Asian instrumentation, the African percussion. So that's kind of the way I've always treated it, and that's kind of, that's been the most useful. And really, we've been talking so much about storytelling, and I think like just going back to that crux of, all of this, which is the story, the characters, the themes. And so if there's a way to express that musically, we start from that. That's the the roots to branches. So
That
yeah.
makes so much sense. That's so neat. And I could hear exactly what you're talking about in the Hills of Tenchiko. Like all
Oh,
the
cool.
melancholy aspects at the beginning, like you're saying, and how it turns into this body tavern song, if you will.
Yeah.
Totally hear all of that. Yes, that is so
Oh,
clever.
awesome.
And
Wow.
Nikhil's told me previously that he had about an hour's deadline to write it or something like that. Nikhil, what was it?
Yeah, it was. I had the morning to write it, basically. So it's
Crazy.
having the inspiration and not enough time. I think that's the real magic formula, because you
It
can't
is.
overthink.
Yeah.
Because
Oh, yeah.
right, like you both rightfully said, it's like there's so many aspects to these things that if you're thinking about it granularly, it just would never get done. So you kind of have to go with instinct as much as those things. Um, so yeah, a good dose of inspiration and research and not enough time. I think that's the
Yeah.
key.
I feel like that makes perfect sense. And it's interesting because there are so many words that are used in literature that mean something a little bit different in music. It's like, for example, like you mentioned theme, but theme in the literature rather than the musical theme, they're different things. And there are so many words like that. But what I was thinking about too is the tone of the story, which are, the emotional feelings of the story. Is this a and like you how you bring that into the expression of the music,
Mm,
um, whether it's like with dynamics with its texture or certain kinds of instrumentation and whether it's more melodic or something more homophonic. I think it's just really
mm.
interesting how that comes together in your mind. Like it translates in a different way. It translates musically in a different way. But I love this too. And so going back to, I'm curious too, from your perspective, especially creating something new like that, like for Wheel of Time or even for Philip's trilogy, something that I've noticed that happens a lot in fantasy, I think, is the influence of Howard Shore's Lord of the Rings. I feel
Yeah.
like that has been so influential. I feel like every time I hear my husband playing a fantasy video game, I can hear the influence
It's
of Lord of the Rings.
totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. It also almost makes me think also another kind of influence is, are you familiar with Carmina Burana?
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah, I always feel like I could hear that too. In
100%.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
100%.
So I don't know. It's interesting. I'm like, these almost have become motifs in fantasy music, but it's also really clever because you've been creating your own stuff too. Like it's developed in a different way too. So it's kind of like adding to the narrative of fantasy music and what that could sound like in a different way, even if we're playing with somewhat similar themes.
Well, actually, now that you mentioned it, Joanna, it got me thinking about stuff I used to listen to in high school, which is completely different to fantasy music, but it kind of speaks a similar language. And the stuff I'm thinking about is like Led Zeppelin or Iron Maiden or stuff like that, where they adapted or they were influenced by Lord of the Rings or influenced by, Greek mythology or whatever it is, and they would put that into the music, and the music would never sound fantasy, but you would read the lyrics, and it's like, oh yeah, this is like, in the darkest depths of Mordor I met a girl so fair. It's like, what, like, what's going on right now? And it's you could see where the influences all come from. And I think, to the point of Howard Shore, like he's one of my absolute favorite composers, and it's hard, he casts such a big shadow, and I think that the tough part, the challenge, is trying to write something knowing there's this legendary music out there, and it's how do you try to do something that feels like its own thing. And that also goes to the idea of in-world music or world building, like music as a form of world building, is that there are so many fantasy shows now out there or fantasy adaptations, and you could listen to the score and you go, oh, that feels like fantasy music. Or you could listen to the score and go, oh, that feels like Harry Potter. That feels like, Wheel of Time, or that feels like it's the Game of Thrones, those have a unique characteristic that makes it feel like it's part of that world, and it's not part of any others. And I can think of just as many fantasy scores in games that feel that way as don't feel that way, right? Like, to your point, Joanna, was like, there's so many where it's like, insert fantasy music here,
Yes.
and it's like, how do you make it feel like it belongs in that world and that world only? So that's always the challenge.
It's always a challenge. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is the easiest conversation for me to lead, guys. I'm loving it. So two things. First thing, Nikhil, I haven't ever told you this before, but when Hills of Tanchico first came out, I was singing it around the house so much that my 4-year-old started picking it up. he was just walking, don't know, to get an apple or something like that, and he starts going da 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 da, and I'm like, "Are you?" He's like, "The Chico song." I'm like, "Oh, there you go."
Oh my God, that's incredible!
Yeah, so you've got a 4-year-old fan. He's not always a fan of me, but he's a fan of you. Second thing, I think you guys have spoken to this so much already, but it does seem to be. It used to be, the music that we kind of put into the text, but now texts themselves have inspired so much music. And I'm thinking as well of like The Dark Tower, and there've been so many songs and albums that have been coming out in relation to The Dark Tower. Maybe not so many, but certainly a few. And the other big one is Malazan. I mean, there's especially heavy metal. It seems like there's a lot of people who, like a lot of artists and albums and songs that have come out inspired directly by Malazan. And I love this idea that people are now reading and being so inspired by it that it becomes a source of music. And it's like these two things are kind of symbiotically braiding back and forth into one another. I'm just kind of tagging along with the conversation you're having, but I do think that's a really interesting thing. And I think maybe now that we're in the digital age, those connections are becoming more and more rapid and more and more varied. It's wonderful to see, especially with video games as well, Nikhil. I think that's another one as well, where it's maybe these three things all kind of tying together. Creation is just it's wonderful to see. I have one more question, Nikhil, and you wrote it down in the Google Doc, so I hope you have a good answer. When you were speaking about composition, and I loved what you said about kind of theme first, and then kind of building everything around that. But you've got this thing written down here, if I'm not revealing our secrets, that the role of cultural authenticity in musical storytelling. And I think that's such an interesting topic, because obviously we're creating you are creating these songs based out of a text you've read, and these texts are very often inspired by geographical locations, but there's also a challenge there, I guess, that you never want to seem like you're just aping a particular culture or sort of, what's the word, kind of hitchhiking.
Cultural appropriation.
Yeah, typical culture. Yeah. So I'm wondering how you go about navigating that.
So I remember years ago I watched Brian Wilson interview when he was talking about Pet Sounds, the Beach Boys, and he was talking about how he had learned from Phil Spector, who had kind of famously created the wall of sound in the 60s, and how you could combine different instruments together and suddenly you can't really tell what that instrument is anymore. And that really was a big influence for me personally. So I'm always trying to kind of hide instruments behind other instruments, work with instrumentalists to say like, let's play this the wrong way. This instrument has been played, the traditional way for hundreds or even thousands of years. Let's take it out of that context. Now it is in a completely different place. So what would be the wrong way to play it? Or, better yet, like if I can't find an instrumentalist for that particular thing. Like I'd worked on a horror film last year, and it was very influenced by like Cape Cod and that area. But I found this Thai instrument, doom scrolling on Instagram as one does. Finally it paid off because I found this Thai instrument and called the Ken, and doesn't sound like Cape Cod at all, of course, but taken out of that context, it suddenly feels like the wind in the ocean. So I bought it and I learned to play some rudimentary phrases. Of course, I played it terribly, but it doesn't matter because it's world building. So it's not about necessarily hitting all the notes perfectly right. It's about creating a vibe, an atmosphere, for this thing to live in. So I think there's part of it is like, let's displace this instrument. Let's make it feel like, what is that? If it's a singular instrument. In the Hills of Tanchico, I took the Malaysian plucked instrument and I doubled it with a mandolin. So now you have no idea what that thing is. It's like, kind of sounds like a mandolin, but doesn't. And combining percussion, like I had some kind of very almost like action drum hits that I put buried underneath, like really low in the mix, and I added some African percussion to that, and Indian percussion. So again, you have no idea where one thing ends and the other begins. And so that was kind of the idea, because like I'm very influenced by Robert Jordan too in the way he would do that culturally. Like he would have the Shan Chan civilization is like Asian influenced, but then they would have a Southern drawl for some reason. It's like how do these things, they should be almost disparate, but they go together because of their contrast. And so, at least musically, that's like my thought on it.
That's
And
a clever solution. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like, it's like we don't need to go by tradition because this is a different world. So there is no tradition, yeah, I don't know. That's my thought. How about you both? Like, is there any, things in various shows or films or games or anything like that where you felt like, oh, that sounds different to what I've heard, or like, do you find it harder to find those types of things? Like do fantasy music that you hear in these shows or films or games, do they feel like, oh, that could have belonged anywhere, or do you find that to be?
That's a really good question. What about you? Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to give one example I think does it really well, which is Ramin Djawadi and his Game of Thrones stuff.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think it's telling that when everyone talks about how far Game of Thrones went down the tubes in the later seasons, there's two things that people still say, which is that the actors were still acting, they were doing their best, and the music is still stunning. And I absolutely would agree with both of those things, but especially the music. I think it's so interesting the way that Ramin Djawadi does actually create the culture of Game of Thrones in that initial opening song where you kind of travel around the world and so you immediately get a sense of what this world is, and that this world feels very far removed from our own in a lot of ways. But also the way that he has these different themes for these different locations immediately clues you in on where you are in the world. As we transition from scene to scene, and I find that really well done and evocative. And that was the main one that came to my mind when I was listening to you, Joanna. I don't know about yourself.
Yeah. That's like the best example.
Yeah, that's great.
Really is. Like, I wish I had thought of that. I had thought of that. Yeah, I don't play a lot of video games, to be honest. And I get, you know what I could say is I always talk about this. So people are probably tired of hearing me say this. When I was reading the Witcher books, because I read all the Witcher books that have been published so far, except for the most recent one, because I don't think it's in English yet. I'm not sure. But while I was reading those, my husband was playing the Witcher 3 video game. And I loved the soundtrack to the Witcher games.
Amazing. Yeah.
Loved it. Yes. Yeah. And he played, what is that card game in it?
Gwent.
Yes. Is that what it's called? I loved even the music to that. Like, and it's funny because sometimes like if I play a video game with my husband, which isn't very often, but sometimes we'll play a video game together. And sometimes, it depends on the game, but sometimes I almost want to play on mute, which would drive him crazy, and we don't because it would drive him crazy, but because it gets so stuck in my head, and if it's not interesting enough, I don't want something monotonous in my head. I'm really picky. I'm really picky about the music I want stuck in my head. But with that game, I never got tired of hearing it in the background, and he played it for hours and hours. I shouldn't embarrass him, but he played it a lot.
Yeah.
But I never got tired of that soundtrack. I loved it. So that's my example.
That's a fantastic example. That soundtrack is amazing, and I feel like it's like, of course, it's the themes and everything, and then it's also the instrumentation is so unique to that world. You feel it. There's the Eastern European instrumentation, the vocals, everything. It's like fantastic.
That woman's
So
voice
transportive.
that comes in when you're fighting, and it goes da 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 da, and you're like, okay, it's time.
Yeah.
And then it fades away, and you've got that kind of da 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 as you're just kind of riding your horse around the. Oh, it's a brilliant game, Witcher 3. I think the fact it came out in like 2015, and it's still the main example of music in video games. Yeah, the other one.
And I think I want to say it even enhanced my reading experience of the Witcher series. It's not my favorite series. It wasn't like a top 10 for me, but I think it enhanced my experience, and it made me think. I thought about that example too when we did the music collab on your channel, David, and Philip brought up the Lord of the Rings soundtrack as his favorite album because he was talking about how even though he's read Lord of the Rings long before the movies came out, that now he has that picture in his head. I mean, there's something to be said too about adaptation actors getting in your head when you read the books. But also the music gets in his head now when he reads the stories. So I think that there's something to be said about that.
That is so cool. Yeah, it's the headcanon, it's like, right? They say it's like, oh, this character is in my headcanon now, or I guess in this case, like this piece of music.
Yeah.
The other example of video games I was going to bring up very quickly is the Red Dead Redemption games, which I don't know if either of you.
Yeah.
They intersperse again real world music with just a fabulous soundtrack, and I won't belabor it because it does the same thing as The Witcher 3, but again, emotional resonance and emotional beats and world building all at once. I think there's a huge discussion to be had there. I think though that's probably a good point to end it. Thank you very much for your time. I haven't said this to either of you properly, I think, on air, but thank you very much to both of you and everyone, but I have you guys kind of in the room with me for your contributions to that music video that I did, because I thought both of your answers were just fabulous and sterling, and I appreciate how much you went the extra mile, especially Nikhil. You were kind of under the weather at the time, weren't you?
Yeah.
And you still pulled out this absolute banger, and then Johanna as well with Dark Side of the Moon. I was just indebted to you both.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was one of my favorite collabs to ever participate in. And Nikhil, I listened to a lot of Beatles after that. So.
Oh, yeah? Oh, awesome. Yeah. I love Dark Side. That was going to be my other choice, honestly. Sorry, I was just going to say I have it on vinyl. And so sometimes I'll listen to it. It's just beautiful. It's just the perfect listening experience.
Yes. It's the best on vinyl, too. Way better than like a CD or, I don't know, even MP3. So
100%. Yeah. It's like the way it was intended to be.
For sure.
I was just going to say, now that we're at the end of the video and fewer people are watching, it's just my friends who are watching. Oh my goodness, that video was so hard to put together. I always thought a collab video would be kind of the easiest thing ever, because you get the clips, you put them in a line, and you know. Oh my goodness, and Johanna knows this. Hours and hours of painstaking. Have I screwed up anybody's clip?
Oh man.
Oh my goodness, I'm so proud of how it turned out, and so many wonderful contributions. But I think I watched that video before I posted it 3 times more than any of my other.
Same here. And the thumbnail was, so I did the thumbnail for that, and it was so much. It was so funny because it felt to me like organizing people on risers in choir, like trying to get everybody in their little window. It was fun. It was an amazing video, though. Loved it.
Yeah. The thumbnail had its own Sgt. Pepper thing going on.
Yes, it did. It really did have a Sgt. Pepper.
What kind of happened there was I created a thumbnail and I showed it to Johanna, and I'm like, "What do you think?" And she's like, "Would you mind if I just?" I think she said it more kindly than this. She definitely.
It looked like the original thumbnail David had. Forgive me, David, for saying. It looked like a play area that his kids played in.
It absolutely did. I'll see if I can find it. I think I might still have it somewhere. So
I want to see.
Yeah. Right, guys. Thank you very much. It was a joy to speak to both of you. And I'll just leave it there. Your channels will be linked down below. And until then, I'll see you on the next video, guys. All the best. Goodbye. Bye.
Bye.